Now I'd like to pass it over to Mariah Van Zer. She is the Strategic Transportation Planning Manager at the City of Kelowna, and she'll be introducing today's presentation. Thank you.
All right. Hello, everyone, and thank you so much, Tom, and thanks everyone for joining us today. I'd like to introduce you to Cameron Noonan, our speaker for today's session. Cameron Noonan has been a transportation planner with the City of Kelowna for the last 5 years. He uses the results of the 2007 and 2013 Okanagan Travel Surveys regularly in his daily work and served as the project manager for the 2018 Okanagan Travel Survey, which we will be sharing with you today. Cameron has a BA in Human Geography from Simon Fraser University and his master's in Community and Regional Planning from UBC. He's originally from Vancouver and moved to the Okanagan in 2016 and enjoys using data to tell stories about everyday life within our cities. So with that, I will pass it to Cameron.
Great. Thank you, Mariah. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for taking the time to join us. I'm very excited to share some of the highlights of the 2018 Okanagan Travel Survey. This is the third survey of its kind done in the Okanagan, and it really is one of the largest public surveys ever done in the valley besides the census. When we think about transportation, our minds usually go to things like roads and bridges, but ultimately transportation is about people. And in order to make sense of regional travel patterns, you need to understand quite a bit about how we organize our communities, our households, and our daily lives. Before I begin, I'd like to thank our project partners. These surveys take a lot of resources, and it could not have happened without them. So thank you to the Ministry of Transportation and Infrastructure, the City of Vernon, the City of West Kelowna, the District of Lake Country, West Bank First Nation, Central Okanagan Regional District, and the District of Peachland. So what exactly is a travel survey, and why do one? In a nutshell, we ask a random sample of people to tell us a little bit about themselves and record the trips that they make. It provides a comprehensive and statistically representative picture of how people move around the region, which is extremely valuable and difficult to get through other means. So for example, we have ongoing efforts to count the number of vehicles on the road, the number of people on buses or bike paths, but household travel surveys are one of the only ways to answer questions such as, where are those people going and for what reason? And how do those patterns vary by demographic groups? Questions which provide a deeper understanding of current conditions and are also necessary to make more informed predictions of how things might change in the future. The survey itself was conducted by Malatest, a market research firm based in Victoria. Roughly 50,000 letters were sent to randomly selected addresses in the Central Okanagan and Vernon, inviting people to participate. Our response rate was just under 1 in 10, which is actually fairly high compared to some other types of polling. People were given a unique code to log into an online portal where we asked people to tell us about all of the trips their household made on the previous weekday. These responses were then weighted by different demographics, such as neighborhood, family structure, work status, and the type of dwelling, to ensure that we got a representative sample of around 4,800 households, representing 10,000 people, and a log of about 30,000 trips. You'll see throughout the presentation that results are often divided into 4 different pieces: the City of Kelowna and RDCO East electoral area, the West Side, which includes West Kelowna, WFN, Peachland, and the RDCO West electoral area, Lake Country, and the City of Vernon. For people on the call from the Central Okanagan, rest assured that the report published online does provide individual results for each jurisdiction and electoral area. Before we go any further, I really should address the elephant in the room, or really the reason that I'm in my kitchen right now. The pandemic has changed a lot about our daily routines. Many of us are working from home, and we're making far fewer social trips. This isn't from the survey, but I thought I'd share some really interesting insights from Google based on their users' location data. Trips to work are down about 20% below normal in the Central and North Okanagan. Trips for retail and recreation are down about 15 to 30%, and we're making slightly more trips to grocery stores, probably because we're eating more meals at home. We know that transit ridership has taken a significant hit, but on a positive note, more people are walking and biking than ever before. Activity on pathways such as the Okanagan Rail Trail and Abbott Street is up 25 to 50%. I think we can all agree that November 2018 feels like a very long time ago, but this survey still has value as a benchmark, both in the short term to understand how the pandemic is changing our behavior, and in the future as hopefully things start to return to normal. Another caveat to keep in mind is seasonality. This survey provides a very detailed picture, but only captures a moment in time. And we know that travel patterns vary across the year in the Okanagan. For example, this chart shows how traffic on the bridge varies throughout the year. Surveys like this are typically done in a shoulder season to represent an average condition. So the 2007 survey was done in May, the 2013 in October, and the bulk of the 2018 data comes from November. But when I layer on the seasonal demand curves for other means of travel, you can see that the fall time period does create some challenges for measuring the number of people walking and biking in particular. For the rest of the presentation, I'm going to be walking through a typical day in the central Okanagan in Vernon, or at least what typical used to be prior to the pandemic, and trying to draw out some interesting patterns and trends along the way. On a typical day, residents collectively travel about 4.8 million kilometers, or the distance to the moon and back 6 times. The majority of this distance is covered by driving, but people also walk and bike around the world twice, and our transit system carries people around about 3 times around the world. Travel demand is defined by the 2 rush hours, or peaks. The morning peak is a sharp spike, which quickly dissipates, while the afternoon is a more gradual building of demand. Still, at most, only 1 in 7 residents are traveling at a given time. This may sound surprising, but consider that many people don't actually leave the house on a given day. And on a related note, even at the peak of rush hour, only 5% of vehicles are in use, that is, being driven. The other 95% are parked, taking up an area that's similar to the combined floor space of all of our homes. If we imagine a future where most vehicles are driverless and part of an Uber or Lyft style service, reducing the need for parking could transform our communities. So starting our day with the morning peak, which is dominated by trips to work and school. Roughly half the population makes a trip between 6 a.m. and 9 a.m. on a typical weekday. This includes around 80,000 workers, 30,000 K-12 students, and about 15,000 post-secondary students. This map shows the most common destinations in the morning for Vernon residents. You can see, unsurprisingly, that destinations are focused on areas of employment. A quick note for these maps. Throughout the presentation, you'll see that results aren't shown for all parts of the study area. And this isn't because nobody lives there or travels there, but we don't have a big enough sample in those places to show reliable results at this level of detail or risk compromising privacy. In the central Okanagan, you can see the most common destinations in the center of Kelowna, particularly that roughly triangular area between downtown, Landmark, and Pandosy, where about 40% of the jobs in the central Okanagan are. Overall, about a quarter of people who work in Kelowna live elsewhere. Roughly 10,000 people cross the bridge from the west side in the morning. Another 3,000 people come from Lake Country, and about 1,000 people commute each way from the central Okanagan to Vernon and from Vernon to the central Okanagan. If we zoom in for a closer look, we can really see the concentration around employment, noting the area around Landmark as well as downtown. You can also see some of the larger schools, UBCO, Okanagan College, as well as Mount Boucherie and Constable Neil Bruce on the west side, as well as Rutland Middle and High School. Driving is the most common way people get to work, or about 4 out of 5. But people are generally about twice as likely to walk, bike, or take transit to work as they are for other types of trips that they make. Commutes are often the most routine trip we make in our daily lives, and more discretionary or spontaneous trips, things like shopping, recreation, errands, are often more convenient by driving. One particularly exciting result is that 1 in 10 residents in central Kelowna, roughly speaking, the flat part of the city north of Mission Creek and west of Orchard Park, bike to work. Considering this survey was done in November, and those seasonal curves which I showed earlier, it's likely higher at different times of the year. The average commute time in Vernon and the central parts of the city of Kelowna is around 18 minutes. In the rest of the central Okanagan, it's about 30 minutes. It's not represented on the slide, but looking specifically at Kelowna, one interesting pattern is that commute times are relatively stable across different parts of the city. What changes is that people in more central areas are often closer to work, meaning they don't need to travel as fast and are more likely to walk, bike, or take transit to get there. Moving on to the midday. When we talk about transportation, there is a lot of focus on the commute, our trips to work and school. While commutes are often the longest trips we make and the most routine, they represent only about a third of travel overall. After 9 a.m., commuting gives way to different kinds of travel in the midday. During this time, roughly 3 out of 5 residents are away from home, at work, school, or running errands. Looking at this destination heat map for the midday, trips tend to be concentrated around major shopping and service destinations. Zooming in, you can see major destinations such as the Midtown area around Orchard Park in Kelowna, or along the highway on the west side. And these are places which are busier during the midday than in the morning peak, something to keep in mind when a lot of attention goes into the morning rush hour. And taking a look at Vernon, we can see the Village Green area north of downtown a lot more clearly. One way to understand the peaks and valleys of travel demand is to look at how different age groups travel at different times of day. Travel by young people is mostly limited to the morning peak and early afternoon around school bell times. For middle-aged adults, the afternoon peak is around 5 p.m., while older adults tend to travel more in the midday. This is an important point because the population of the Okanagan is aging. The region has long been a retirement destination, so perhaps it's not surprising that as more of the baby boomers retire, our population is both growing and growing older at the same time. You'll notice looking at the chart that this aging is happening faster outside of Kelowna, where almost half of new residents in the past decade have been retirees. Although this is one place where West Side and Lake Country are diverging. Lake Country actually has much fewer retirees than the region as a whole. Looking ahead to the future, as this aging trend continues, this could mean less pressure on the peak hours, particularly in the morning, but a filling in of midday demand. It may also increase the demand for transit and other mobility services for aging people. The afternoon peak is the busiest time of day in most places. Compared to the sharp morning peak, the afternoon is much more gradual. It starts off with an earlier school peak between 2 to 3 p.m. and then builds as more people get off work and run errands on their way home. If you recall, roughly half the population makes a trip during the morning peak. The afternoon is closer to 2/3. Part of that is that the afternoon peak is longer, but still more different groups of people are traveling, and the patterns are more complex. This is why in many places the afternoon just feels busier, even if the number of trips being taken at one time is actually lower. starting off the early afternoon with school travel. And while I'm sure that all of us here today walk to school uphill both ways, roughly half of kids are driven to school each day. One thing to keep in mind is that about half of parents drop their kids off on the way to work, meaning that those trips have less impact on the overall amount of driving. But still, that leaves about a quarter of students who are specifically driven to school each day. There is some good news though. The number of middle and high school students taking transit to school has tripled since 2007, and more elementary students are walking to school compared to a decade ago. Not surprisingly, children in more walkable areas are more likely to walk to school, but still, every morning, a substantial number of students, about 6% of the total, get a ride to school for a distance shorter than a kilometer. Distances to school are getting longer, which is likely a consequence of how the region is growing into the hillside areas. And the share of students riding school buses has also increased. Although this is preferable to having kids driven for both congestion and emissions, it does create significant financial challenges for the school district. One demographic factor, which I haven't touched on until now, is gender. It may be surprising, at least to half of the population, but women make more trips on average than men, about 10% more trips overall. And looking at the age ranges on the bottom right, this is likely due to more trips to pick up and drop off children and other household errands. Overall, women are responsible for about 2/3 of trips made to drop off passengers. Moving on to take a look at Modeshare. Auto driver Modeshare decreased about 2% between 2007 and 2013. Things were pretty stable between 2013 and 2018, within the margin of error for these surveys, which is around 1.5%. While I know we'd all like to see these numbers change faster, a stable mode split in a rapidly growing region at least means that our efforts to encourage mode shift are roughly keeping up with population growth. The travel patterns that we see are the results of decades of land use and transportation decisions, along with broad societal trends, which reinforce each other over time. A good analogy for mode shift is it's kind of like interest rates. Little changes at the margins can be impactful. And this is because the relationship between traffic volume and congestion is not linear, meaning that small shifts can have a big impact. There are also some bright spots to share on the topic of mode split. Transit has been growing among young people, as I alluded to earlier, with a near tripling in mode share between 2007 and 2018. For post-secondary students, the big jump came through the introduction of UPass in 2011. For middle and secondary students, it has grown considerably since 2013. And again, given the impact weather has on biking, stable mode share between May 2007, where the average temperature was 21 degrees, and November 2018 can be seen as a positive. Looking at the destination heat map for the afternoon, you can see that trips are much more distributed across the region. Still, plenty of trips are being made into core areas, but many people are returning home. Moving on to the evening. By 6 p.m., the majority of people are at home. Only about a quarter of the population makes a trip after 6 p.m. People in the central Okanagan and Vernon have traveled 6 times around the world. And this means that in a year, people in the area cover 1.2 billion kilometers, or further than the distance from the Earth to Jupiter. Despite this astronomical distance, one of the most significant trends in the data is that the average number of trips taken per resident, what we call the trip rate, fell in both the 2013 and 2018 surveys. Decreasing trip rates have been observed in surveys conducted elsewhere, and In some ways, it is natural. As the Okanagan grows and becomes busier, there is a point where residents can no longer just run out their door and drive anywhere at any time of day. People may be starting to plan their routines around the busy times of day. And while this is an unavoidable consequence of living in a city, our challenge is to provide people with more convenient transportation options, and also to encourage more services, amenities, and crucially, employment closer to where people live so they don't have to travel as far to meet their daily needs. Looking at the chart on the right, you can see that trips fell faster outside of Kelowna, and particularly on the west side and Lake Country. The aging population, which I showed earlier, likely has something to do with this. Trip rates have decreased particularly for younger people and older adults compared to middle-aged people. And while we don't have a definitive explanation for this yet, for the younger adults, one potential explanation is that the share of post-secondary students who also work has been falling in the past decade. It does create some interesting conclusions. So for example, 20 to 24-year-olds are now making roughly the same number of trips as 80-year-olds. A falling number of trips per person means that while the population has increased about 20% since 2007, the number of trips made on a typical weekday has only increased by 8%. Several factors may be contributing to this trend, including an aging population, changing nature of work, and a rise in e-commerce. And the pandemic has almost certainly accelerated this trend, though it remains to be seen whether it is a lasting change. If you recall from the previous slide, trip rates are also falling faster in Vernon and the west side compared to Kelowna. The total number of trips made by west side residents actually fell slightly between 2013 and 2018. And in Lake Country, the number of trips grew by about 5%. The fact that the overall number of trips is growing slowly, and in some places even declining, hasn't stopped traffic volumes from increasing at certain spots and certain times of day. And it's important to remember that the survey does not include commercial vehicles or trips by tourists or residents outside of the study area. Overall, these findings challenge our intuition of population and demand for travel growing together as a straight line, often to infinity. Travel demand is a lot more dynamic or elastic to changing conditions. While residents are making fewer trips, these trips are getting longer on average. This trend is likely due to the way the region is growing. Although we have seen some momentum behind growing in our town centers, there is still a significant amount of development happening on the edges. And this is challenging because longer trips are harder to shift away from driving. Very few people are willing to walk longer than a kilometer or two, about 20 minutes, or bike more than about 5 kilometers. Transit can be competitive for longer distance trips, but that is very dependent on getting the routes and schedules to line up, and that is particularly hard in places with lower density. Longer trips means that the overall distance driven, or what transportation nerds call VKT, vehicle kilometers traveled, is increasing. In many ways, VKT is a better measure of congestion and emissions than Modeshare. And this is because Modeshare will treat a 1 kilometer driving trip the same as a 50-kilometer driving trip across the region. VKT has increased by 13%, with only 5% more driving trips made. This increase isn't consistent across the study area, however. Things are relatively flat in Vernon, up about 15% in Kelowna and Lake Country, and up by about 7% on the west side. VKT is growing more slowly than the population, but still increasing overall. This offers an explanation why Many people would say that congestion is getting worse, even if the amount of trips made is relatively steady and in some places declining. This map shows the average distance driven per household in different parts of the central Okanagan. You can see that distances are somewhere on the order of 2 to 6 times longer on the edges of the region. It should be noted that households tend to be larger in more suburban areas, but even on a per person basis, the number is still about double. For community planners, a map like this highlights the need to encourage more family-oriented housing closer into the core. And a similar pattern can be seen at a smaller scale in the city of Vernon. One final thing I'd like to share. There is an old idea from an Italian physicist called Maggiores Constant that people are willing to spend about an hour each day traveling. And historically, as we've invented ways to move faster, from walking to trains to cars, our cities have expanded alongside of them. And while this theory isn't scientific, we can see some evidence of it in the Okanagan. This map shows the median time spent traveling by sub-area. These residents are traveling to different places, some much further than others, and by different modes, but the average time spent traveling is similar. And although our travel time constant seems to be a little bit less than an hour. And this highlights an important distinction, something that we have to keep in mind whenever we're looking at new investments in transportation. Are we enabling people to access more of the city, to accomplish more in a day and really save them time? Or are we simply allowing people to move faster and live further away? So that was a typical day in the central Okanagan and Vernon. I know that was a lot of information, numbers and percentages, so I thought I'd close with a few key takeaways. Residents are making fewer trips each day. An aging population certainly contributes to this, but trip rates fell in almost every age bracket. This means that the demand for travel is growing slower than the population. However, trips are getting longer, meaning that the overall distance driven is increasing. What I've shared today is really just the start of exploring this data and trying to understand what has changed since 2007 and what hasn't, and hopefully being able to understand a little bit about how our efforts to encourage more sustainable transportation in recent years have fared, and most importantly, where we can improve. From my personal experience, I've used the data from the 2013 survey weekly, often daily, since I started with the city, to answer all sorts of questions from the small scale related to individual development applications, all the way up to the broadest, most high-level forecasting. The 3 reports for the 2018 survey are published online if you go to smarttrips.ca. I'd recommend starting with report number 3. There's a good executive summary in there, which covers most of what I've mentioned today and more. There's also an appendix where the results are split into individual jurisdictions. Sharing the data itself can be challenging because we need to protect the privacy of our respondents. We're going to be sharing the data with our funding partners, and we're also opening to partnering with the academic community if we can get privacy agreements in place. And hopefully sometime in the future, we'll be able to share some more anonymized and aggregated versions of the data, though, as I said, we have to be very careful to ensure that individuals can't be identified. Yeah, so that was a whirlwind tour of the 2018 travel survey, and happy now to open it up to questions.
Thank you so much, Cam. Arlene here. I just want to say thanks for that fantastic presentation. Lots of interesting information there. It was definitely new to me, so appreciate you bringing that forward to us today. Just for everyone, I'm Arlene. I am a planner here with the City of Kelowna, and I'm a member of the PIBC Okanagan Interior Chapter. I'll be facilitating the Q&A today. So if you have any questions, there is a feature on the top right-hand portion of your screen. We are, as Cam said, not quite sure what to call it, but it has 3 little shapes, a triangle, a square, and a circle. And you can click on that, click on Q&A, and please feel free to pop any questions that you have into that Q&A feature. So I'm just going to check here. I'm not seeing anything yet, but maybe to get the ball rolling, I was kind of wondering, Cam, how you mentioned a little bit about your work and how you use this information. Is there anything that you're kind of really looking forward to this being able to inform, or anything that you're working on right now that the information from the travel survey has really contributed to?
Really, as I said, it really informs almost everything we do. It's almost every project we work on. There's always a question that comes up of like, oh, what does the travel survey say about this? So it really is versatile and invaluable information. So really just about everything.
Just about everything. Yeah, I can imagine it's quite comprehensive. I do see a question popping in from Alexander, asking about accounting for services such as skip the dishes, etc. in the future. Comment on that, Cam?
Yeah, that's a great point. So as I mentioned, this doesn't include commercial vehicle trips, which in our current definition, someone driving for a service like skip the dishes would be considered a commercial trip. So it is something to keep in mind as we see these services like that. We may be seeing kind of decreasing personal trip rates, but some of that is being offset by more deliveries, through Amazon or skip the dishes, services like that. So we do have to be cognizant of that. Although generally speaking, the expectation is those would be, specifically deliveries would be less focused on the peak hours compared to people's shopping trips. And driving for skip the dishes might actually reduce VKT compared to everyone running out and going to and from the restaurant.
Perfect. Thanks for the clarification.
Thanks. I see another one popped in here. Hold on a second. So from Carla, when you use the term West Side, is that because you're aggregating data from West Kelowna and Peachland?
Yeah, just for kind of ease of the presentation, I aggregated all the West Side municipalities, so West Kelowna, WFN, Peachland, and the Artesia West electoral areas together. But if you go to the report on smarttrips.ca, you can get individual results for Peachland and all the other jurisdictions.
Thanks, Cam. Question coming in from Tom, and something that I was wondering about as well. What sort of lessons learned came from the data collection process, and what's the ideal time frame for the next survey?
That's a great question. I think in terms of lessons learned, we were surprised at the rate of response was a little bit slower than we had hoped for, which meant that our data collection period dragged on much further into November than we had initially hoped. So I think that biggest lesson learned is giving people more time, I guess, to complete the survey before the weather turns. As for the ideal time, I think it's very challenging. I think there are obviously drawbacks to doing it in the fall, particularly related to active transportation. I know that some places, for example, the city of Vancouver does a specific summer transportation survey with their residents. But if we did it in the summer, we would be missing school travel, which would be a pretty significant challenge as well. So there's always a compromise, no matter what time of year you do it.
Have you ever looked at winter travel? I was just curious, popped into my mind about kind of impacts on transit. Maybe I can speak for myself. I bike less in the winter, but I take the bus more. So is that something that's been come to mind?
Yeah, actually, through our transportation master plan that the city's been working on and our existing and future conditions report, we took a look at, well, I showed those seasonal curves. And one of the interesting patterns that we see in the winter, particularly on the bridge, is that while the two peaks remain in the same place, roughly the same amount of traffic volume coming across the bridge, the midday is actually significantly lower in the winter compared to even the summer, certainly, and even the fall.
Great. I'm not seeing any other questions. I'll just give people a minute to kind of pop their questions into the Q&A since we have a few extra minutes here. I do see a question from Abdul, so I'll read that out. Given the mode shift in 2007 to 2018, do you think non-motorized modes and transit are competing? I.e. the increase in the transit mode is due to cyclists and pedestrians changing to transit. What can be done to bundle them to compete against driving?
Well, I personally don't see them as competing. I see them as complementary. We often say that, really, if you think about what makes driving so convenient, it's the fact that it leaves, well, your car leaves when you want. You can generally go anywhere in the region quite quickly. And it's hard to replace and carry lots of cargo as well. And it's hard to replace that convenience all with a single mode. So it's hard to imagine doing all of your trips by walking or by biking or on transit. So I really see them as complementary more than competing, really. As for bundling them, I think hopefully we've seen some cities do sort of link their bike share systems or e-scooters, that sort of thing, link that with transit passes as a way to make that first and last mile to get to and from a transit stop more convenient. And that could be a way to bundle biking and transit together.
Great, thank you. I have maybe one more curiosity on my end, just so giving people a chance to put any last questions in before we break. Was there anything else, since we have a couple minutes, that was like a surprise that kind of changed year over year between the surveys for you, Cam? Anything interesting? So it seemed like the mode shift, like you said, we're holding steady or like making small incremental improvements. Was there anything surprising, or was it just kind of maybe what you expected to see year over year? Not to put you on the spot or anything.
Yeah, I'm kind of drawing a blank a little bit for the more surprising outcomes. I think maybe one of the more initially surprising outcomes, but actually sort of makes sense when you think about it, is when you compare the 2013 and 2018 surveys and where the auto driver mode split increased and decreased between the two surveys, it actually increased more in central areas. Still lower than the average and certainly lower than the amount of driving in suburban areas, but still hoping for that to go down, but it was actually went up slightly. And I think the explanation for that is that seasonality, where as the weather turns, those are residents living in the central areas probably were riding their bikes or were walking or maybe taking transit. And then as the weather turns, they start to move more back towards driving.
It does make sense. That's interesting to capture that kind of depending on when you take the survey. So I don't see any other questions. I didn't mean to put you on the hot seat there, Cam. So thanks for answering my curiosity there. I think with that, and not seeing any more questions, we will give people a little bit of a break to go outside before their lunch hour is over and maybe take a little walk, get some fresh air, as we all need these days. So I will take it upon myself to close. But thank you so much to Cam, Mariah, Tom, Stephen, everyone who helped get this organized today. Really appreciate it. And please do look for a survey in your inbox just about some more information on what you would like to see with these webinars going forward. So thank you very much, everyone, and have a wonderful rest of your day.